Welcome to Dialogue. The 2023 Paris Peace Forum is taking place in Paris with the theme of seeking common ground in the world of rivalry. The forum this year aims to find efficient responses to the urgent challenges of our time, from climate change to cybersecurity and outer space governance. What common ground are we trying to seek? In this increasingly polarized world, is it still possible to find common ground in an endless rivalry? To discuss these issues and more, I'm glad to be joined by Justin Vaïsse, founder and director general of the Paris Peace Forum. That's our topic. I'm Xu Qianduo. Welcome to Dialogue, Justin. We know there are a lot of forums, dialogues like the Shangri-La Dialogue, like the UN General Assembly, Munich Security Conference, and we have Paris Peace Forum. So what makes the Peace Forum stand out?
So welcome. First, welcome to Paris. Really glad to have you here. It's not only a dialogue. That is, we have people from around the world, from north and south, from east and west. We have heads of state and government. We have people from the private sector, people from NGOs, from foundations, etc. It's a multi-actor meeting, and it's not just a dialogue. It's a place where we work on initiatives, projects, coalitions, etc. We try to make a difference. We don't have, among the 90 sessions that will happen during the 2 days of the forum, we don't have one that is just to discuss about things, which is always useful, but sometimes doesn't go very far in changing the world. What we're trying to do is to change the world, and we try to align forces of governments, of the private sector, of civil society, in order to make a difference, whether it's on critical minerals, whether it's on climate, whether it's on refugees, on global health, on artificial intelligence and other issues. We try to make progress in setting norms, in identifying which types of political organizations should be put in place, to try to mobilize resources, etc., in order to make progress in global governance.
Mm-hmm. Well, we know this is the 6th edition of the Paris Peace Forum. So what's the agenda? And we know that the theme for this year, you guys have chosen is, seeking common ground in the world of rivalry. Why such a theme?
So every year we have a global slogan or a theme that encapsulates the spirit of what we do. It doesn't cover everything we do, but it gives the flavor of the year, if you like. And this year we chose, this slogan you mentioned, seeking common ground in a world of rivalry, because we're more and more concerned that geopolitical competition is making it impossible to do cooperation. In other words, the exacerbated competition that we see, especially between the US and China, is making it harder and harder to get agreement on coordination, on cooperation, on issues that, however, we all depend on: climate, disappearing biodiversity, global health, etc. So what we're trying to do this year is create spaces of work, if you'd like, where we have all the parties convened, and where we're able to put aside this geopolitical competition in order to make progress on these issues that gather us all.
Common ground, I'm wondering, what kind of common ground? You mentioned climate change. I think it's easy to understand. Everybody knows, basically, aware of that, the risks we are facing. We need to work together. That's a common ground. But when it comes to the other, challenges, like in Gaza, the crisis there, and the Ukraine crisis, do you think we are able to find a common ground?
So from the beginning, the forum was not conceived to focus on hot crises, if you'd like. We're not doing crisis management, and we're not really equipped to do the sort of quick diplomatic maneuvers that would be necessary to address crises like the Ukraine one or the Gaza one. So what we focus on is building, I would say, even crafting peace in the longer term, that is better organizing the world so that these issues of cybersecurity, of climate, refugees, etc., don't come back to haunt us 5 years from now, 10 years from now, 50 years from now. This said, we're also addressing this crisis because of the magnitude and the impact it has on the rest of the international system. It will not go very far because now is still the time for the armed operations in Gaza, but at least it sort of sparks some hope for the future that we can get back to this negotiation on the two-state solution, which is the only foreseeable solution of this question. So we're doing the long term mostly, but we're also taking a bit of time to try and do our part on this tragedy.
Mm-hmm. Well, speak of the long-term effects of efforts, and also, speak of this, relationship among, especially the big powers. The relationship like between China and France. You were with President Macron when he was in China in April. Share with us your impression. How do you evaluate the outcome of the visit?
So I think the outcome was very positive. First of all, it should be mentioned that it was the first time really after COVID, right? After all these years where leaders didn't meet. So it was important in itself to sort of have a full-blown discussion, and President Macron had 2 long opportunities to meet with President Xi, both in Beijing and in Guangzhou, and so that was important. Second, I think one of the important outcomes of the trip was to get China's cooperation on trying to solve one of the most important issues of our time, which is how do we find resources for financing both the SDGs, the development goals, and also the green transition. So how do we change the international financial system so that it's able to produce enough resources, not only to face the challenges of current weather catastrophes, etc., but also help less developed countries to finance the green transition. And so that resulted in the June summit, where China was represented by the Prime Minister, and it led to a number of discussions around this Paris Pact for People and Planet, that is to say, increasing the resources that the international community has for poverty and for climate, and better organizing the tools we have, whether it's private sector financing, whether it's debt suspension clauses in lending money, etc. So that was one of the really good outcomes, I think, of the trip by President Macron. And then lastly, I think it was more on a bilateral level, the importance of keeping the people-to-people and the cultural exchanges rolling after COVID has really frozen everything. So that was another, I think, good point in this trip.
China also declared the end of financing basically projects which is coal-fired plants, along with its Belt and Road Initiative.
Yeah. So I mean, there has been some progress, undoubtedly, but the fact is we are still opening, and it's a collective we, but it's very often in Asia, we're still opening coal plants, and that's really problematic. This must be balanced with the energy needs of the less developed countries, obviously, but there are other ways to do that are as cost effective and energy effective as coal power plants, and so that's something we'll be focusing on. It's a good example of what we do at the forum, gathering a coalition of private funds, international organizations, and government actors to make sure we go even further. And then at COP28 in December in Abu Dhabi, in Dubai, we'll be able to make decisive progress.
Mm-hmm. You talked about China-France relationship. I wonder where are we now in terms of this bilateral ties, given the obvious impact of this pandemic, 3 or 4 years, and of course the strategic competition from Washington with China, and then the EU's policy on China, for example, de-risking rather than decoupling, but still there are disputes between the two sides. How do these factors, impact or influence France's perception or policy making on China?
So, I guess there's no doubt that the relationship is not what it was 10 years ago, and the accentuation, I would say, of the geopolitical competition certainly has had an imprint, has had an impact on what these relations are. The COVID period was not very good because it led to a reduction of the overall discussions and exchanges between the two countries. This said, I think that the policy of de-risking clarifies things. No one wants to depend on others, and that's a truth that has been with us as long as great power competition has existed. No one wants to depend on other powers, and de-risking, I think, clarifies relations, and also I think makes it easier to have discussions and negotiations on essential issues without being bothered by this dependency, whether it's on critical minerals or on microchips, etc. So I don't see this necessarily as a big risk, and I think it certainly doesn't lead to decoupling. One good example is the increase, not the decrease, of trade between the US and China, that in spite of the tensions of the last few years has been noticed. That is, that there's been an increase in this, it's around 700 billion, if I remember correctly, dollars a year, which is more than what it used to be. So I do think that de-risking and the continuation of economic relations can coexist, and that they clarify things on geopolitical terms.
But other people would say, when we talk about decoupling, de-risking, it's a sharp contrast with previous times, where we talk about interdependence. We see interdependence or closer trade relationship that lays the foundation of a closer and stable relationships. So are we seeing, because of the retreat of globalization, somehow we are seeing more risks and more, maybe not conflicts, but certainly not closer relationship?
No, I agree with you. That is, we had a period in which the sort of American-dominated world of the 1990s and 2000, the world of globalization, I would say of happy globalization, it doesn't mean that there were no conflicts and no tensions, but by and large, the world was more open. As the journalist Tom Friedman famously said, the world was flat. That is to say, you could exchange easily. It was a world that was largely guaranteed by the American power, whether sea lanes or the opening of markets or
so it's not
security
flat anymore.
So no, I believe it's very different. So let me give you a very concrete example. I do fly a lot, which is not good for my carbon imprint, but which is necessary for making sure that the Paris Peace Forum attracts people from around the world. And there are many routes that used to be direct and where planes have to do detours. So for example, to get to Beijing right now, we can no longer fly above Russia. So the flight is at least 2 hours longer than what it used to be. Another example is when you go over the Middle East, it's still dangerous to go over certain parts of Syria. It's dangerous, obviously, right now to go above the Near East. And so you see that the world of globalization, which was not only flat, but that also ensured direct air routes, is no longer with us, and that there are many more mountains or hills in that world that make that change globalization. It doesn't mean we have deglobalization, so it's not going backward, or it's not exactly as if we were undoing what has been done during the 1990s and 2000, but at the very least, it has stopped increasing.
Of course, there are talks of de-risking here in Brussels and also in Washington. Do you think they are the same? Because for Washington, it's really about their strategic competition, using their own words, against China. Some would say that's a containment, against China, to slow down the Chinese technology, slow down the Chinese innovation. But for there's a reason for Washington to do that, because Washington wants to maintain its predominant position around the world. But for European Union, they are not in, say, competition with China for global domination. Do you see they are the same? Well,
no. Here again, I agree with you. There are two versions of de-risking, if you'd like, and then there's the specific question of microchips, which is different, which is really about maintaining the advance, because this technology really is in the US and in Taiwan, as we know. So that's a specific case, and on the maintenance of the technological advance. One of the pillars of US dominance, yes, I agree with you. The EU position is slightly different. The EU position is to have been burnt by the Russian example of depending on Russian gas, which was largely a German policy, which was linked to the abandonment of nuclear power after the Fukushima incident that led Angela Merkel to decide, sort of in a rush, to do away with nuclear energy, which led to two bad outcomes, one could say. One was the increase of the use of coal, and Germany still uses a lot of coal, for about 1/4, I think, of its power generation, which is emitting a lot of CO2 gases. And second, it also led to an increased dependence on Russia, on Russia's cheap gas, and the rise of Russia's, I would say, at least leverage on Germany and on the rest of Europe. Once again, it's the general principle that no one wants to depend on one other power, and so depending on someone at 50 or 60% is fine. Depending on someone at 100% is not good, because it sort of skews the relationship between the two powers, because you know that if the other power decides to cut off that supply, then you're in a very bad position. And so even though the EU doesn't want to be dominant, that explains why the policy of de-risking was adopted and is now conducted.
Mm-hmm. Well, speak of that, I think it's sort of related. President Macron once said in an interview that the great risk that Europe faces is, quote, getting caught up in crises that are not ours, and Europe must resist the pressure to become American followers. Was he talking about strategic autonomy of the European Union?
So sometimes, yeah, I mean, the aim of strategic autonomy was always pursued by the French. Then we had a bit of difficulty convincing our fellow Europeans that it was something important and meaningful. And over the course of the 2010s, it sort of more and more became more obvious to other Europeans that strategic autonomy was important. First, when things got bad, starting in 2014 in Russia, but I would say also in the Middle East with Daesh, with the resurgence of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict in 2014, and obviously in 2016, or rather early 2017, when the Trump administration took office. Then Europeans, especially other than the French, realized that it was necessary to make sure that Europeans could act on their own, something that the French had always advocated for. And so it became more apparent that Europe should turn into a geopolitical force, not just a geoeconomic or soft power force, but that it should stand on its own, reduce its dependency, increase its means of action. And so what President Macron said during his trip was that we should not, he was very specific in his words, and so the message was we should not be led by an acceleration of the crisis that would be caused by American initiatives, whether it's Speaker Pelosi's over Taiwan, Speaker Pelosi's trip to Taiwan, or other initiatives that are, let's say, unhelpful and pour oil on the fire. That's certainly not good. But on the other hand, what President Macron repeated, especially after these remarks, is that he is very much in favor of the statu quo. And so the statu quo should not be changed either by one side or by the other.
Well, we are going to have, the general election in the United States. You talked about the Trump administration. Now people say there's a real chance of, another term of Trump presidency. Do you think Europe is ready for a second term of Trump?
It's hard to say. On the one hand, it will surprisingly come as a shock for many, even though we had Trump for 4 years. And many are clinging to the idea that, of course, President Biden will be re-elected, which is statistically the most likely, but we've seen so many surprises in the recent years. Yeah, it's changing, and there will be many things happening between now and November 5, 2024, which is the date of the election. Others in Europe are, making the point that it's exactly the reason why Europe should be more independent, have more strategic autonomy, make sure that it doesn't rely 100% on other countries, including the US, including for its security. And we know that President Trump had asked his advisors whether the US could simply withdraw from NATO, that it's the type of ideas that he has entertained since the 1980s. So it's been 40 years or more that he has criticized NATO as an alliance, and that he thinks that Europeans are taking advantage of the US in terms of the security. It sort of triggers among Europeans the idea that if the US somehow withdraws or starts being less present in Europe, then they should step up. And honestly, it's something that France has advocated for, not the exit of the US, let me be very clear on that, but the fact that even with the presence of the US, we should be more reliant on our own forces, including from the security point of view. And if such a thing happens, that President Trump is re-elected and he has a policy of being less present in Europe, then we should be able to step up and make Europe more resistant and more standing on its own. I would simply add to conclude that Europe has been tested many times. If you see the sort of scenario, it's always the same one. That is to say, it starts with a crisis, Europe is disunited, Europe doesn't react, and then the magnitude of the crisis forces Europeans to unite. It takes some time. There are 27 countries, it's not easy. But in the end, Europe is always reinforced by crises, not weakened by them. And so you see a stronger Europe now than you see 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 30 years ago. And so should something like a Trump re-election, bad news like that happen, I have no doubt that Europe will be able to react and to strengthen in the face of that adversity.
We'll get more strengthened.
Yes.
And you once said that geopolitics is slowly killing global governance. You said US, China, and Europe should show more leadership and propose a third way to reach a stable triangle of relations rather than bilateral confrontation between Beijing and Washington. Would you please elaborate more on that?
In the 21st century, we slowly realized that there was another danger, which was not internal, which was because of the humans fighting among themselves, but rather because of their environment, because climate change was evolving, was arriving at such a pace that it could endanger the ship itself. It's like an iceberg coming, and we are more and more focused on fighting one another rather than looking at the iceberg coming in the direction where the ship is headed. And that's the illustration of geopolitics killing global governance. That is to say, our inability to focus on dangers that are threatening us all, and climate change has effects in the same way from Guangzhou to Cincinnati and Paris and Lagos, and rather concentrate on these aspects of rivalry and competition. And so the point about leadership was to say that the ability to separate these issues, to compartmentalize, if you'd like, the issues from the ones that have to do with competitions, from the ones that have to do with necessary cooperation, because it's our collective interest and we're all threatened by the same things, is paramount.
If there's a Trump administration again, Trump does not have much interest in the fight against the climate change.
I'm very worried about that. You're right to point this out. That's why I hope that Trump is not re-elected. I hope he's not even a candidate because the judicial proceedings that is involved with, especially the Georgia case, will prevent him from doing so, because it will be a setback for all of humanity.
The bilateral, the trilateral relationship, I want to also have your comments on the recent development, of these rather frequent exchanges for senior officials between Washington and Beijing. What do you make of that? And you also have this largest U.S. delegation to the China International Import Expo in Shanghai, for example. Mm-hmm. You are seeing like a closer somehow or revitalized trade relationship between the two countries. How do you characterize this bilateral ties?
This is a positive development. What you just mentioned, and undoubtedly what we were talking about a moment ago, but interdependence can only go in the way of increasing understanding about the two countries, etc. That has limits. That we've seen very interdependent countries going to war with one another. I'm thinking Germany, the UK, France in 1914, for example, very interdependent, lots of trade, lots of cross-investment, didn't prevent the war. So it's not a guarantee that there will be no more war, but at least it's one piece in the general construction of better understanding between the two countries, and I would say mechanisms for dampening or decreasing the most acute phases of crisis and competition. So these are good developments. Once again, very higher than ever levels of trade and investment between the US and China in spite of the competition. And so this gives a bit of hope that leaders will be able to take this into control before we have a Cuban Missile Crisis type event that leads to this more frequent discussions among the two superpowers.
Mm-hmm. Well, next year will be the year of culture and tourism between China and France to mark the 60th anniversary of the forging of a diplomatic relationship. Yep. Any expectation, how big a role that may play in terms of these bilateral ties?
It would certainly be important. Just on a personal level, I've had the pleasure of organizing both the 2014 and the 2019 anniversaries of these relations. For the 50th anniversary between President Xi Jinping and President François Hollande in 2014, when we organized a discussion on French-Chinese relations in particular. And then in 2019, among President Macron and President Xi Jinping, where we focused on the global aspect. That was in March 2019, and where President Macron enlarged the discussion with Angela Merkel, who was then Chancellor of Germany, and Jean-Claude Juncker, who was then the President of the Commission. And so that was, I think, important moments which marked advances in the better relations between the two countries. Next year will be the 60th anniversary. I hope I will not be in charge because I will still be at the Paris Peace Forum, but I hope it will be marked by a similar increase in good relations and cooperations between the two countries.
Thank you, Justin. Thank you for
coming.